The most perfectly preserved ancient Egyptian human in the world was never intentionally mummified. No priest, no ritual, just sand and 5,500 years of desert heat. He's been in a British museum for over a century. In 2012, we learned exactly how he died, but that's not the strangest part of this story. Before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before there was anything that resembled the Egypt we recognize, there were people. They lived along the desert edges of the Nile Valley, buried their dead in the simplest way available, and moved on. The graves were shallow, pit-dug, roughly oval, cut directly into the desert floor. No stone chambers, no ceremony we can document with certainty, just the body, occasionally a few basic possessions, and sand. And then the desert did something no one planned for. In the right conditions, extreme heat, almost no humidity, fine-grained desert sand in direct contact with the body, moisture leaves human tissue faster than bacteria can break it down. The biological process that drives decomposition never fully activates. What remains is desiccated, preserved, sometimes almost complete. Preserved skin, preserved hair, intact fingernails, facial features that have survived longer than every civilization that rose and fell in the time between then and now. This was not mummification in any intentional sense. No decisions were made, no process was developed, no theology had been attached to it yet. The desert simply did what desert conditions do, and bodies survived. One of the most documented examples of this was found near a settlement called Gebelein, in what is now southern Egypt, in 1896. The body was acquired by the British Museum, where it has remained for over 120 years. Radiocarbon dating places him at roughly 3400 to 3500 BCE, approximately 5,500 years ago. Well before the Old Kingdom, well before the first established pharaohs, well before any of the elaborate practices Egypt is historically famous for. He has no recorded name, no inscription, no tomb architecture around him. He is known simply as Gebelein Man. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum performed a CT scan. What it revealed changed how his story is understood. The scan confirmed a penetrating wound to his upper left shoulder, consistent with a stab from behind. 5,500 years later, the evidence of a homicide was still intact, preserved in exactly the same way the rest of him was. By accident. That is the most important detail. Nobody did this to preserve him. The desert did. And for the next 1,000 years, that was the only kind of preservation ancient Egypt had. The desert was doing this perfectly, and it required nothing from anyone. Then something changed, and the first thing that changed made preservation measurably worse. To understand what came next, you need to understand what the desert was actually doing and how well it was doing it. The mechanism is straightforward, but the results are extraordinary. Desert sand in this region is not simply dry, it is extremely low in moisture, consistently high in temperature, and fine enough in texture to draw fluid from organic material through direct contact. When a body was placed in a shallow pit and covered with this sand, moisture was removed from tissue faster than the anaerobic bacteria responsible for decomposition could establish themselves. The process that drives decay was interrupted before it could begin. What was left behind could be remarkable. Skin that retained its original texture, hair still attached at the root, nails present on hands and feet. In the best preserved examples, facial structure remained identifiable, not as skeleton, but as a person. And none of it required human intervention. The desert did this on its own to anyone buried in the right conditions. Pre-dynastic Egyptians were not strategically selecting desert sand for its preservative properties. They were using the land available near where they lived. Preservation was a side effect, not an intention. Gebelein is one of several sites where naturally mummified remains from this period have been found. The conditions were common enough that these results were not rare accidents. They were regular outcomes of ordinary burial in this specific landscape. Then, a 2014 peer-reviewed study published in PLOS One introduced a detail that significantly shifts the established timeline. Researchers performed chemical analysis on linen recovered from burial sites dating to the Badarian period, approximately 4,500 BCE. What they found were traces of preservative resins and natural compounds applied to the burial cloth. This is not evidence of full mummification, but it is evidence of deliberate preservation behavior. Someone nearly 6,500 years ago was applying specific substances to burial materials with apparent intention. That pushes the earliest documented evidence of intentional preservation behavior back nearly 2,000 years before the Old Kingdom practices Egypt is most associated with. Nearly 2,000 years. The gap between those earliest chemical traces and the established artificial mummification of the Old Kingdom is almost completely silent in the archaeological record. Something was developing during that period. What exactly it looked like and what was driving it, we don't fully know. If this is the first time you're hearing any of this, what comes next is the part most documentaries on ancient Egypt leave out entirely. Stay with it. Something changed in Egypt around 3,100 BCE. Society became more organized, more hierarchical. Power consolidated into recognizable structures, and as the social order changed, burial practices changed with it. The elite began constructing mastabas, large rectangular stone tomb structures built above the ground. More permanent than a pit grave, more elaborate, a visible demonstration of status that extended beyond death. These would eventually evolve into the pyramids. But the first significant consequence of building them had nothing to do with architecture. It had to do with sand. A stone chamber does not desiccate. Move a body from an open desert pit into a sealed stone room and the conditions that made natural preservation possible disappear entirely. No direct contact with dry sand, no rapid moisture removal. Inside a stone chamber, the body follows its natural biological path, and that path leads to decay. The most widely accepted hypothesis among Egyptologists follows directly from this. Artificial mummification was not, at its origin, a spiritual breakthrough or a cultural invention. It was a practical response to a structural problem. The elite moved their burials inside. The desert's solution could not follow them there. The religious dimension is real and documented, but it requires precision. By the time written records exist, approximately 2400 BCE in the pyramid texts, Egyptian theology clearly expresses the belief that the physical body must be preserved for the soul, the Ka, to return to it after death. This belief is not in question. What is less clear is the direction of causality. Did this belief drive the development of artificial mummification, or did the practice develop first out of practical necessity and the theology grow afterward to formalize and explain what was already being done? The texts document the belief, they do not document which came first. What complicates this further is the development timeline. The early techniques that emerged from this period were not the process Egypt is remembered for. Early techniques were crude, basic wrapping, rudimentary treatment, and the preservation results were measurably inferior to what natural desert burial was still producing for lower status Egyptians in nearby pit graves. The full 70-day embalming process, the natron salt treatment, the organized removal and preservation of organs, this level of refinement did not exist at the beginning. It was reached during the New Kingdom, approximately 1500 BCE. It took nearly 1,000 years of development to produce the outcomes that now fill museum collections around the world. Which raises a question the standard explanation handles less cleanly. If the shift to artificial mummification was driven by practical necessity, why did the first attempts produce results that were worse than simply leaving a body in the ground nearby? Why were materials imported from outside Egypt to support a process that was still experimental and underperforming? And why does no Egyptian text, in a civilization that documented almost everything, explain where the idea originated? The official explanation is supported by evidence, but there are things in the archaeological record that it does not account for. 4 of them specifically, and each one is documented. The first thing that doesn't fit is the most direct. Early artificial mummies were worse preserved than the natural ones, not marginally. The desert in the same period was still producing near-complete preservation in ordinary Egyptians buried in sand pits. The elite in stone tombs receiving the new artificial treatment were frequently preserved less completely. If the goal was preservation, and the religious texts are clear that preservation was considered essential, then the method being developed was underperforming the method it was meant to replace. That gap has never been fully explained. The second anomaly requires a map. Chemical analysis of the materials used in some of the earliest known artificial mummification attempts has confirmed the presence of substances that did not originate in Egypt. Specific resins, compounds derived from tree species that did not grow in the Nile Valley, have been identified in preservation materials from this transitional period. These were imported, deliberately sourced from elsewhere and brought to Egypt for use in a process that was still experimental and not yet producing reliable results. The organizational implication is significant. This was not improvised local experimentation. Someone was coordinating the sourcing of external materials for a practice that hadn't worked yet. Third, the class reversal. In the pre-dynastic and transitional periods, lower-status Egyptians buried in desert sand were frequently better preserved after death than the elite receiving artificial treatment in stone chambers. Wealth in this specific period produced inferior preservation outcomes. This is documented. It directly inverts the assumption that mummification was a privilege, because at its origin, the privilege produced worse results than the alternative it was replacing. And fourth, the silence. Egyptian civilization documented almost everything it did. Administrative records, agricultural inventories, religious texts, construction plans. The pyramid texts, dating to approximately 2400 BCE, describe the mummification ritual in detail. What they do not include, what no surviving text includes, is an explanation of how the practice started, who first developed it, why it was considered necessary when the desert was demonstrating a working alternative in the same landscape. For a civilization that recorded so much, this particular absence is notable. These are not gaps in popular knowledge. These are gaps in the academic record. The evidence has edges. This is where they are. So what does all of this mean? What does it say about the moment, if there even was a single moment, when someone decided this practice would exist? The honest answer turns out to be the most interesting one. Go back to Gebelein Man. He was buried sometime around 3400 to 3500 BCE, before the mastabas, before the stone chambers, before any of the practices that defined Egyptian civilization in its most recognized form. He was placed in a shallow desert pit, covered with sand, and left. No decision was made about his survival. The desert made that decision, as it had been making it for thousands of years before him. 5,500 years later, he is still there, in a museum in London, more intact than many intentionally mummified Egyptians who came centuries after him. The central irony of this story is precise. The most iconic thing about ancient Egypt, the practice that filled museum wings worldwide, that shaped how the civilization is understood globally, that represented one of the most elaborate death rituals in human history, was developed to solve a problem the desert had already solved, without effort, without intention, for free. What we know is not in question. We know how mummification worked at its technical peak. We know approximately when it became an established practice. We know the religious framework it was embedded within and the refinements it underwent over 1,000 years of development. What the evidence has not provided is the origin of the decision, not the technique, but the choice. The moment when someone concluded that what the desert was doing was not sufficient. Whether that was a single deliberate decision or a gradual, unannounced drift that left no clear record, the archaeological evidence has not yet produced an answer. No founding text, no named figure, no ceremony marking the beginning. The question that remains genuinely open is not how they did it. It's why anyone decided it needed to be done when something else was already doing it perfectly. If you have a theory about what drove that decision, what made someone look at a naturally preserved body and conclude that a different approach was necessary, leave it below. The most interesting answers to open historical questions often start exactly there. The evidence tells us what they did. It hasn't yet told us what made them decide to.